Bonjour à tous. Donc, nous allons commencer cette première session sur les fondamentaux de l'apprentissage. La première locutrice qui va nous parler est donc Patricia Khul de l'Université de Washington aux États-Unis, une grande spécialiste de l'apprentissage de langage, qui va donc nous parler en anglais des périodes critiques de l'apprentissage de langage. Merci Patricia.
Merci, hello, bonjour, that's the only word I know in French. And so I will be speaking to you in English. I'm very excited to be here today to talk to you about the gap between neuroscience and education, particularly for the very youngest people who we care to educate, and that is the babies of the culture. All throughout the world, I think that many are concentrating on the revolution in developmental science, demonstrating the capacities of young children between the ages of 0 and 5 to learn. In my own lab, both behavioral studies and brain science, the newest brain measures, allow us to safely and non-invasively studying what the brain does as the baby is experiencing a problem that the baby is trying to solve or listening to language. So both brain function and the structures of the brain, we can now measure how the brain grows, the structural connections between areas. We can see how they grow as a function of experience. We're also doing some genetic studies, but I won't talk about those today, and instead we'll talk about some of the newest interventions, both for parents and for teachers, to help all children reach their potential. The two broad messages that I want to convey today to all the attendees, and especially to UNESCO and Ministry of Education in France, who I thank very deeply for this invitation, is that, number one, infants and children in the years from 0 to 5 have a tremendous ability to learn. And that ability to learn can be harnessed by all the nations in the world to prepare our children for school. I think one of the things that we've discovered, not only in my lab but all over the world, is that children really truly need preparation for school. That brain development that happens in the first 5 years is essential to success in school and in life. And the second message that the research is convincing us of is that the social brain is more important than any of us previously thought. The social context in which learning occurs is vital to learning in the early period, and in fact, I think vital to learning all of our lives. Now that we live in a digital age, it's ever more important that we understand the power of face-to-face communication, not only for our very young children, for whom it's essential, but for all of our children K through 12, and for us as adults who require face-to-face communication to really activate our systems in the brain. So today I will be talking about language as my example, but I think that the studies we're doing on language development really pertain to a lot of learning that we do. We know for the area of language that there is a critical or sensitive period in learning. We do not learn languages equally across our entire age range. The babies are, in fact, the young children from 0 to 7 are geniuses at acquiring languages, many languages, if they're exposed in a natural way, and I'll show you later what I mean by that. After the age of 7, there is a steep decline, and after puberty, it's much, much more difficult. So it's important that we understand in development when the periods of time exist in which the brain is particularly open to experience. What a critical period is a window of time in which the environmental stimulation makes a huge difference on the brain, both its function and its structure. To understand how science can inform education, we really need to understand when the critical periods exist and for what domains they exist throughout the areas. Is there one for math, for example? Is there one for social interaction? We know there is one for language. I believe there are critical periods for many domains of the science of the mind. And so science can help us by understanding these critical periods. So I'm interested in the very earliest learning, because I think the principles of how human brains learn can come from studying the baby mind and the baby brain. So we've used a technique. I don't think we'll have sound on this video, but it's okay. The baby is sitting on a parent's lap, and the baby is listening to sounds in the background that come from many different languages. So you can test how infants from many different cultures can hear the distinctions in sounds that are used to distinguish words. Baby sitting on the lap, hearing a vowel like ah, 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 but then it suddenly changes, and we look to see, does the baby orient to the reinforcer? This is a little monkey in a box that's pounding a drum, and the little ones, the 6-monthers, love this. What we see in the videos and what we saw in studies all over the world is that at 6 months of age, the babies are literally citizens of the world, no matter what sounds you use, from what language, and no matter what country you're testing in. All of the babies will orient to the sound changes. They can hear them all. They are citizens of the world. The parents sitting behind the babies, mothers and fathers, are not citizens of the world anymore. They are culture-bound listeners. They respond to the sounds of the language or languages they were exposed to in the first 7 years, but they don't respond to any others. So it is this initial learning. How do babies become like us? They are citizens of the world to begin with, but when do they turn into citizens like us who are culture-bound? Well, the science is showing us that they turn from citizens to the more culture-bound listeners before their first birthdays. So here we see a graph from one of many studies we published. We're testing in Tokyo, we're testing in Seattle, we're testing the babies on ra, la. So they hear ra, 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 then every once in a while la comes up and the babies must turn their heads. And what we see is that at 6 to 8 months, the babies are equivalent in all the countries. But 2 months later, something very important occurs. The babies in Seattle are getting better at this distinction, and the babies in Japan are getting worse, and everybody is doing exactly what they must do to learn the words of the culture. Because in Japanese, the R and L distinction is not used, and so babies who are ignoring it are exactly doing what they should do. Babies in Seattle are zooming forward. We saw this in languages all over the world. This is what the infants can do in the beginning, but by their first birthdays, they are already shaped by listening to us speak, and their brains are beginning to focus on the items that are most frequent. We can do this either behaviorally, as we did 30 years ago, or with neural signatures. So you can see if a standard sound in the blue line is being reporting the ra, 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 the background sound. And then when you change it, you can see the deviant, the red line, immediately shows the brain's reaction to that change. So regardless of brain or behavior, these babies early can hear this difference, and by 12 months, they change. This change from 6 months to 12 months predicts language abilities at age 3. It predicts reading readiness at age 5. It's a very important early measure of the child's ability to pay attention to what's happening in the culture. Babies who pick up on these distinctions, they're really listening, and their brains are changing. And this predicts their ability to learn way out in time, and I think that's extremely important. So what is it that they're doing? What can the babies do early in development that I can't do? When I come to France and spend months, my brain is not changing. I am not hearing and listening and locking on to the key distinctions in French. But when I brought my child here at age 3, she was rapidly picking up the distinctions of the language and beginning to produce the words. The differences in what the infants are doing and what we do is part of this critical period. The babies are able to take statistics, meaning they're listening to the sounds, they're looking at the actions in the culture, and their brains are affected by the most frequent events. And the second one, which I think is even more revolutionary, is that infant learning demands a social context. So about the statistics, so there's a movie here, but we won't be able to see it. When you listen to speakers, I have an English-speaking woman and a Japanese-speaking woman. Infants are sensitive to the statistics of the sound frequencies. So if you listen to the American woman speaking, there's lots of R's and L's. You see that bimodal distribution. If you listen to the Japanese woman speaking, then there are just the intermediate sound, the flap that is the Japanese R. Babies are very attentive to these statistical differences, frequency, high frequency events, whether they see them or hear them or come in through any of the senses, baby brains lock onto the most frequent events. It's a very important principle that frequency matters. That we've got many studies demonstrating this. This was published in 1992. All it shows is that by 6 months of age, the babies in Stockholm and the babies in Seattle were able to detect the categories in the different vowels of the language. By 6 months, just laying in the crib and interacting with people in Stockholm listening to Swedish or Seattle listening to English, the babies were able to form the categories. This happens extremely early. It's an automatic kind of learning that happens in the right context. So a question that we asked that demonstrated the social principle is, if babies are taking statistics, can they do so on a brand new language right at that critical period between 9 and 10 months? We did an experiment. Here we see the results of studies we did in Taipei and in Seattle, comparing the Taiwanese babies and the American babies on a Chinese contrast that is very difficult for me. And what we did in the experiment was give the American kids an intervention. For 12 sessions, they listened to Mandarin native speakers in the laboratory. And we wanted to know what difference it made to their brains. If we, right at that moment when it's the critical period, if they're exposed to a new language, can they take those statistics or not? So again, this is a movie, we won't hear the sound, but here's our native speaker of Mandarin. I had 6 in the laboratory at the time, postdocs, and they're exposing the little ones at 9 months to Mandarin in a natural play situation. They're playing with books and toys, and they get 12 sessions between 9 and 10 months. The babies were rapt, they loved this experience, and they learned incredibly well. So I will show you the results of that study. What did we do to their little brains? Did they learn? We had a control group that just listened to English. Let me show you that first. The control group did not get any better at Mandarin. They'd been listening to English. They, of course, didn't get better at Mandarin, but it was important from an experimental standpoint. But look at the babies who had 12 sessions listening to Mandarin between 9 and 10 months. They were exactly statistically equivalent to the babies in Taipei who'd been listening for 11 months. What is the message there? You give the brain the right thing at the right time, and the brain learns with extraordinary capacity. But we then asked this, do infants learn from a machine? At the time, many software companies were arguing that tapes, of French or, Tagalog would teach the babies different languages from a machine. So we brought new babies in and did the same experiment, but now they're paying attention to a video screen, and they did. They crawl up to it, they pay attention, they look at it. We assumed, watching the babies, that they would learn from the video. We ran a second test with audio only, but the results surprised us. The audio-only condition showed no learning whatsoever. The video condition showed no learning whatsoever. The babies were looking at the screen, they were not learning anything. So, the social brain is extremely important early in development. The baby brain takes statistics, but only in a social context. Humans need other humans to learn, and I think that's a very important message, not only for the children, but for our children in school, for us as adults. Social experience is extremely important. It's taxing, it's complex for the brain. Now, we're also doing brain science, spend $2.5 million to buy a magnetoencephalography machine. So why would you put little babies into big, expensive machines? It's because we want to understand what's going on in a social context. What is it that human contact does to the brain to make it more efficient? One of the studies that we did, here's a baby. We were the first in the world. I'm glad this video is playing. One of the first that we've done in the lab was we were the first to put little ones into a magnetoencephalography machine, a MEG machine. And it's completely non-invasive and silent. The baby's listening through insert earphones to the sounds of many languages. We're trying to understand what it is that goes on as infants have a sensory experience. And what we discovered, I think, is extremely important to science and to education. Here's a still, it's complicated, but what I'm trying to show in this study is how the sensory area, the auditory area, reacts to the sound. Obviously, it's a sound, so the auditory brain has to be responding. But we were also looking at, towards the left, the Broca's area, which is the motor area of the brain. And what we see, whether the babies are being tested in their native language or a foreign language, is that not only the sensory area lights up, but the motor area lights up, even at 6 months before the babies can talk. What this means is that as babies have a sensory experience, when they listen to something, the motor areas of the brain that will eventually allow them to join the conversation, they are active. Sensory motor connectivity is primal to the brain. Educators always tell us that action and agency are extremely important to learning. And I think what we have here is a brain science result that demonstrates a comparable finding from the standpoint of the brain. This is for the scientists in the audience, but I'm going to skip over it now. There is a very interesting data Mark Rakel and I have shown that sensory motor propagation is there at birth between these areas of the brain and changes its direction of propagation flow right at the critical moment in development, and its direction predicts future language at 24 months. This is an exciting new finding, but we'll pass on that now. I want to show a little bit about our bilingual studies. Stan mentioned how bilingualism is becoming a focus, and it is truly important in the United States because everyone in the United States believes incorrectly that bilingual exposure confuses babies. We've shown in studies at 11 months that monolingual and bilingual babies are equally capable of processing both languages. The monolinguals respond, if they're English learning babies, only to English, but the Spanish-English bilinguals respond equally to both languages. This is what we expected. This is what we found. And also the bilingual babies have an advantage. They show greater activity in prefrontal cortex, where attention switches between the two languages. And in fact, in tests on their cognitive flexibility, we are showing that they have advances over the monolinguals. I've now taken this finding to Madrid, Spain, where the parents speak Spanish to the babies but hope that their babies can become bilingual. We are doing an intervention in the public neighborhood infant education centers in Madrid, and showing the teachers and bringing tutors from the United States as helpers that in 1 hour per day of play sessions, we create amazing learning at all 4 ages. We have groups starting at 7 months and going up to 3 years, that regardless if they're at 7 months and just beginning their babbling, or all the way up to the age of 3, that those in the intervention group in red, as opposed to the blue line, which is the standard bilingual education program in Madrid, we're showing huge gains in the production and comprehension of English, while their Spanish skills stay the same. These are very, very exciting findings. The Ministry of Education in Spain is now scaling it up to 13 schools and over 800 children in a randomized control trial. And we're enrolling in the poorest neighborhoods as well as the moderate and high-income neighborhoods. In the poorest neighborhoods, there are many gypsy, what the Spanish ministry called gypsy children. They're migrants, and the parents in these homes do not read. So we have children in the intervention who have never, ever been read to. And our preliminary findings in the scale-up this year are showing that these children, these gypsy children, are the ones who are showing the hugest gains. And so we're very excited about this, because one of the principles is that if you want to level the playing field, if you want to prepare everyone for school, if you want to have an equitable educational system, you bring all children ready to learn at age 5 to school. There's our bilingual graduates when they finish our intervention. So one of our messages is that language skills are malleable. So one of the agents of change, so how do you change children's language skills? The parents and the teachers are key. One of the factors that we've learned about our studies on the preparation gap, the fact that's been demonstrated in the United States and elsewhere, that children come to school from poor socioeconomic families having listened to fewer words, 30 million words less. We've been interested not only in the quantity of language input, but the quality. One of the factors that influences children's learning is what's called the use of parentese or motherese. At the top, infant-directed speech. At the bottom, at the top, adult-directed speech, infant-directed speech. Infant-directed speech has big intonation contours, and it's much slower. It's also a clearer signal, as we show when you study the acoustics. Our work in the homes of children shows that the prevalence of parentheses correlates strongly on the left with future language skills, whereas standard speech, like I'm using, does not correlate with future language. In parent coaching studies at 6 and 10 months, we show great increases in parents increasing the child-directed speech, increasing their use of parentheses, and children's language at 14 months. Now we have them out to 27 months. It keeps growing. The gains that you get from early language input last a very long time, and we're doing brain studies now to test whether or not we've changed the brains of the children in the intervention groups whose parents are coached, as opposed to the control groups whose parents are not coached. So finally, last thing I'll say is that music also affects the brain. In exposure tests in which we give very young children 12 sessions of a musical rhythm, and in this case, it's the rhythm of the waltz, and here are the babies tapping out, "Take Me Out to the Ball Game," which happens to have a waltz rhythm. And the babies are tapping that out, and when they listen to this for 12 sessions, and you test them in the MEG machine afterwards, you see that their abilities, again, complex results, but very, very clear. The babies who have had the music intervention as opposed to controls are not only better at musical rhythm alteration detection, but also better at speech alteration detection. What it means is that music, things like rhythm, can teach the baby to detect patterns better. And pattern detection is a very general feature of what we must do. What young brains need to do is understand that an orderly world has patterns, that the detection of patterns is very good for cognition in general. And I think the result of this study is important because it shows that the arts and music should not be separated from cognitive learning. At least in the schools in the United States, the music and the art classes are being removed to work on STEM, to work on science, technology, engineering, and math. I think this is a mistake. The brains of children need to be enriched in many ways in the arts and in culture and in STEM. And so we talk in America sometimes about it shouldn't be a STEM focus, but a STEAM focus. Arts should be added to the STEM fields. The future of the science of learning, I think, is extremely exciting. 4 fields are participating: neuroscience, education, child psychology and learning, and machine learning, because artificial intelligence and how machines learn and how they compare to how humans learn is going to be a very great catalyst for the science of the future and the connection between the science of learning and education. Thank you so much for your attention.
Beaucoup Patricia pour cette magnifique présentation. Donc on a quelques minutes pour prendre des questions dans la salle. Si vous voulez, vous pouvez les poser en français ou en anglais. N'hésitez pas.
Paola Antolini, I am a scientific journalist. I want first to thank you for the bright presentation, and also thanks the organizer and the Stefan Dehen. Now the question is, as you know, in Italy, in education, we include the music, we include the art, and this it maybe the difference that we are still, let's say, in one way, more in equilibrium with all you that you explain. I would like to know, how many here did you study this process? And how many communities, because I am an anthropologist, in terms of your excellent work? Thank you.
Thank you. I've been studying this topic for more years than I care to mention, for a very, very long time. And we've done quite a few studies around the world on language. The work on music is brand new, and so we have just done that in the United States, but we think it's extremely important to understand why the early exposure to experience is so powerful for the brain. And music may be a very good way to test the power of early experience, because we can see that a simple signal like music that is evolutionarily very old, think about dance and music as a coordinator, social coordinator for many cultures, it's ancient. And to show that the rhythm in music can affect the more general cognitive processes like pattern perception, gives us a clue about why the baby brain and the experience of the baby brain is so potent for learning. And so I think there's a general message. But the studies on language we have done all over the world, in Japan, in Russia, Sweden, Finland, France, Spain, Mexico. We have done these studies many, many places, and that's why we can say there's a universal change that's happening in all children, and that the mothers and the teachers, we are the agents of change. Baby brains are ready to learn no matter where they come from, and no matter what their social status. The early brain is curious and wants to interact. But what the baby brain needs from us is opportunities to learn. That's where the gap is. The opportunities have to be there at the right time for that brain to grow in the way it's intended to grow. The brain expects experience. If experience doesn't happen, we've done studies in which children are in foster care. If they're in foster care in the United States, it means they were abused or neglected. The brains of these children at age 5 are very, very different. Connectivity is weaker. Cortical thickness and cortical surface are reduced. It's as though without experience, the brain decides to stop. The processes that are ready to roll with experience, when the experience is absent, the brain stops, and that period of growth is cut short. The very important result.
Thank you so much to UNESCO for inviting us and for your excellent expose. My question is, I'm France Marquet, representing South Asia Foundation. My question is, there's a campaign in UNESCO for the mother tongue. So that means you have the mother tongue, then you have the language of the country, and then you have eventually another tongue. How do you, at your purpose, how do you calibrate?
So our studies, if I understand your question correctly, so it's comparing the mother tongue to a new language. And in our studies in Madrid, what we're demonstrating is that the addition of a new language does nothing to interrupt the primary language from growing. So in these babies in Madrid from 7 months to 3 years, we show that in the intervention group where they're getting that 1 hour a day of social play with language, their English is zooming forward, and so is their Spanish. So the control group and the intervention group have equivalent growth in Spanish, but the intervention kids are also growing an ability in English. And so studies of the brain suggest that the two languages occupy separate areas in the brain, and the reason that executive functions are higher in the children who have two languages is that the brain gets used to toggling back and forth between speakers that they want to interact with in English and speakers they want to interact with in Spanish or a second language. Babies have no trouble keeping these two languages separate, and they have no trouble growing the brain in a way that has expertise in both languages. And in addition, they have a cognitive benefit. We show that the kids are more cognitively flexible. That doesn't mean they're smarter, not higher IQ, but it means if you give them a new problem to solve, we have baby versions of these problems, that the babies who are bilingual are more flexible. They can invent a new solution. So we have a little test with a plastic box, and we put a toy inside the box, and the baby can see that toy. And we let the baby, but only one door is open. We let the baby pull the toy out repeatedly from the one side. Then we switch the box around, so the door is on the other side. And the monolingual babies are completely puzzled by this. When you turn the box around and they have to reach in from this side, the monolingual babies typically cannot solve it. But the bilingual babies, you have the door on one side and then you turn it around and they look at it and they go in the other door. So they are more cognitively flexible. They're better at inventing a new solution. So from our perspective, and we're trying to convince Americans of this, that the two languages are wonderful for culture, better for their economic growth because it gives you more opportunity, better for their cognitive and health benefits to be bilingual and have better cognitive flexibility. So it's a good thing all around.
Thank you very much. In the interest of time, we're going to move to
Yes.
Ghislaine's talk.
Thank you very much.
Patricia.